The fork was halfway to my mouth when my daughter-in-law said, "Don't start your boring, useless story again." Still, I chewed the pot roast I'd made for her parents, pretending not to notice my son shrinking beside her. As their fake laughter filled the room, I reached under the table and squeezed my granddaughter's trembling hand. While the smell of dinner faded, another scent grew stronger. Disrespect I'd been funding for years. The same hands that raised her husband had quietly paid for her salon trips, her sunroom, her silence. That's when I decided, if she can mock my stories, she can survive the one the bank's about to tell. All right, before we dive into this crazy story, do me a favor. Subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. Eleanor Brooks liked setting her dinner table early. Linen napkins smoothed, silverware aligned, the soft glow of the pendant light warming the room. After 72 years, she found comfort in ritual. Tonight felt no different at first. Pot roast simmered in her slow cooker, the familiar scent drifting through her Charlotte home like a gentle invitation. When everyone finally settled into their seats, Michael on her right, Samantha across from her, Grace beside him, and Samantha's visiting parents filling the remaining chairs, the meal looked promising enough. Grace smiled at her, the kind of smile that still made Eleanor's chest soften. She waited until the first few bites were taken before starting, her voice calm and warm. This recipe actually comes from a summer when Samantha didn't let her get any further. "Please don't start your boring, useless story again," she said, not quietly, not kindly, just loud and sharp, the way someone snapped a twig they didn't want to bother carrying. The sound seemed to echo against the hardwood floors. Samantha's parents exchanged a stiff look before giving awkward little laughs, polite but hollow. Their discomfort wasn't for Eleanor, it was for the moment itself, for the breach in surface-level civility. Michael's fork clattered softly against his plate, then went still. His shoulders tensed the same way they had since he was a child who avoided arguments by pretending he wasn't in the room. "Sam," he murmured, but nothing else followed. Grace froze, her eyes widening. Under the table, her hand reached for Eleanor's, fingers curling around her grandmother's palm with a quiet, protective squeeze. Eleanor kept her posture relaxed, her chin slightly lowered as if she were considering her next words carefully. "I wasn't planning to go on long," she said, her tone gentle. "Just sharing a memory." Samantha waved a dismissive hand. "We've heard it before. I just don't want my parents trapped in another hour-long monologue about chores or schoolhouses or whatever. We're trying to enjoy dinner." Her parents chuckled again, uneasy but complicit. Eleanor felt the sting, felt it deep enough that it pressed against her breath, but she kept her face smooth. She had lived through harder moments, and she had learned long ago that dignity was a discipline. Michael shifted in his seat. "I think you're being a little harsh," he said, without lifting his gaze. "Mom was just talking." Samantha shot him a glare. "I'm not being harsh. I'm being honest." "There's a difference." Eleanor let the conversation pass over her like a cold wind. She cut another small piece of roast, lifted it to her mouth, and chewed slowly to steady herself. Across the table, Grace looked heartbroken. Stories, Eleanor thought, were the only inheritance she had been sure her family wanted. They weren't grand or dramatic, just pieces of a life she'd lived with pride, and now they were useless. She laid her fork down carefully. "Let's just enjoy the meal," she said with a soft, even smile. But the room's energy had shifted sharply. Conversation resumed in a strained rhythm, everyone pretending the earlier moment hadn't cracked the table's warmth in half. Samantha chatted with her mother about a planned sunroom addition. Her father complimented the roast, though his voice carried the stiffness of someone trying to patch a sinking ship with duct tape. Grace hardly touched her food. When the meal ended, coats were retrieved, goodbyes offered. Samantha hugged Eleanor quickly, perfunctorily, as if checking off a box. Her parents thanked her again, their voices polite in that way people spoke when they knew something unpleasant had happened but didn't want to name it. Once the door closed and the last car turned onto the cul-de-sac, silence settled over the house like dust. Eleanor stood in the foyer for a long moment, the quiet pressing gently around her. She could still hear Samantha's words, sharp, careless, dismissive, echoing at the edge of her mind. She walked back to the dining room, turned off the light, and rested her hand on the back of her empty chair. No anger, no tears. Just a steady, dawning clarity. Something had shifted tonight, and tomorrow she would decide what to do with that shift, quietly, fully. Morning light slipped through the sheer curtains of Eleanor's living room, settling over the old coffee table where she had arranged a stack of folders, pens, and a fresh pad of sticky notes. She hadn't slept much. Every time she closed her eyes, Samantha's voice, sharp, dismissive, cut through her rest. Boring. Useless. Eleanor inhaled slowly, opened the first binder, and spread its contents across the table. Years of meticulously kept records lay before her. Statements from the local credit union, small notations in her neat handwriting, monthly summaries she'd filed without thinking much of them at the time. They had always been a routine, not a weapon. But this morning, they became something else. She uncapped her pen, placed a yellow, sticky note beside her, and began scanning the pages. Her finger traced each withdrawal. Amounts she recognized. Some she didn't. Transfers marked household, groceries, unexpected expenses. Gentle euphemisms for moments she remembered clearly. Calls from Michael saying, "It's just this once, Mom." Or Samantha's clipped voice in the background insisting they needed to take care of something quickly. A charge for $420 at a boutique furniture store. Another for $285 at a salon Samantha loved. And more. Strings of little losses that added up to something far larger. Eleanor highlighted each line in deliberate strokes. Her hand didn't tremble, but something inside her tightened with each mark. Halfway through the second binder, a knock sounded at her door. 3 quick raps, confident, familiar. Eleanor rose slowly, smoothing the front of her sweater before opening it. Marla Jensen stood on the porch, her gray hair pinned back, her expression sharp as ever. "Morning," she said briskly. Then her eyes narrowed. "Something's off. You look like you've been thinking too hard." Eleanor stepped aside, letting her in. "Come sit," she murmured. Marla took one look at the spread of paperwork and exhaled through her nose. "Sweetheart, that's not hobby work. That's detective work." Eleanor touched one of the highlighted lines with the tip of her finger. "I heard something last night I can't quite shake." Marla sat forward. "About what?" Eleanor didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. She simply repeated it in the exact tone Samantha had used. Flat, uninterested, slicing. "Don't start your boring, useless story again." Marla's jaw set hard. Her outrage almost immediate. "She said that to you? In your own home?" Eleanor gave a small nod. For a moment, Marla looked like she might stand up and march straight over to Samantha's house. "I swear, the audacity of that woman. After everything you've done for them." Eleanor's gaze dropped to the statements. "I thought I was helping. You know, supporting them so they could get ahead." "You were," Marla said firmly. "But there's a difference between help and being taken for granted. And this," she gestured at the highlighted pages, "this is disrespect you've been financing." The words landed with precision. Clear. True. Marla tapped the pages again. "It's time to stop financing disrespect." Eleanor leaned back in her chair, letting the sentence echo through her. It wasn't spoken in anger, just clarity. The kind that brought a strange sense of calm. Her phone buzzed beside her. She picked it up, expecting a message from Grace, or perhaps Michael trying to mend the strained ending of last night. But the name on the screen tightened something in her chest. Samantha. Eleanor hesitated before opening it. "Hey, Eleanor, could you transfer a little money? It's just a small emergency expense." "Nothing huge. Thanks." No greeting, no explanation, no acknowledgement of last night. Just assumption. Marla saw Eleanor's expression shift. "Who is it?" Eleanor handed her the phone silently. Marla read the text, her eyebrows climbing in disbelief. "She has some nerve." Eleanor set the phone down beside the piles of highlighted withdrawals. Her fingers brushed across the neat columns of numbers. Years of quiet giving, quiet sacrifice, quiet enabling. She had always believed kindness was best expressed in small ways. But now, looking at the long list of withdrawals Samantha assumed she would never examine, Eleanor felt something new settle in her bones, something unexpectedly steady. Not anger, not revenge, not yet. Just readiness. She picked up her pen again, uncapped it with a soft click, and drew a slow highlight over the next withdrawal. One more mark in a trail she was suddenly determined to follow to the very end. Her phone buzzed again with another message from Samantha. Eleanor didn't check it. She simply whispered, more to herself than anyone. This time, she won't like the answer. And she knew the moment was coming when she'd send one back. Douglas Trent's office sat above a row of tidy storefronts in South Charlotte, the kind of small professional building Eleanor had driven past hundreds of times without noticing. Today, she noticed everything. The quiet steps up the carpeted stairs, the faint lemon scent in the hallway, the steady presence of Marla walking beside her. "Remember," Marla murmured as they reached the door. "Just tell him the truth. All of it." Eleanor nodded. "I will." Inside, the receptionist greeted them and led them into a warm office lined with legal books and framed certificates. Douglas Trent rose from behind his desk as they entered, a tall man with calm eyes and a measured way of moving, like someone who understood the weight of the problems people brought him. "Mrs. Brooks," he said, offering a firm handshake. "It's good to meet you, and you must be Marla." Marla took the handshake with a brisk nod. "We've brought some things for you to see." Eleanor set her canvas tote on the desk and lifted out the binders she had stacked so carefully that morning. Douglas's brows lifted slightly at the sight of them. "That's quite a record-keeping system," he said. "I've always liked order," Eleanor replied softly. Douglas opened the first binder. The highlighted lines glowed under the lamplight. Store charges, transfers, repeated withdrawals of inconsistent amounts. He scanned slowly, page after page, the quiet rustle of paper filling the office. Marla waited only 30 seconds before leaning forward. "She's been drained for years. Small amounts that don't look suspicious, but they pile up." Douglas nodded without looking up. "I can see that." He flipped another page. "How long has this pattern been happening?" Eleanor folded her hands in her lap. "About 10 years." He finally looked at her. 10? She nodded once. "Does your son know the extent of these withdrawals?" Douglas asked. Eleanor hesitated, not out of uncertainty, but out of long habit. "Michael asked for help sometimes, yes, but many of these he didn't see." Samantha handled their bills. She had a way of making things sound urgent. Marla gave a sharp hum of agreement. Urgent for her, mostly. Douglas continued turning pages, his expression controlled, but no longer neutral. "Mrs. Brooks, these aren't small favors. This is a pattern of regular financial reliance. Some of these amounts would be difficult even for someone still working full-time." "I didn't want them to struggle," Eleanor said quietly. "And now?" Douglas asked. Eleanor lifted her eyes to meet his. "Now I want to stop." Douglas leaned back in his chair, thoughtful. "Then let's talk about what we can do." He took out a legal pad and began outlining a plan in clean, efficient strokes. First, restructuring her accounts so only she had authority over them. Next, removing any secondary access tied to Michael or Samantha. Then, securing her retirement accounts under protective provisions so they couldn't be touched, accidentally or intentionally. Eleanor listened closely, absorbing every word. Marla sat with her arms crossed, but there was approval in her posture. This is what she should have done years ago. Douglas turned another page of the binder. We'll also update your estate documents. If there are beneficiaries you no longer wish to include, we can revise that immediately. There was no tremor in Eleanor's voice when she answered. I want everything protected. All of it. Douglas gave a decisive nod. Then we'll make sure it's protected. He stood, retrieved a set of forms and placed them gently in front of her. These will start the process. Once filed, access to your accounts will change permanently. Eleanor picked up the pen. The click of the cap echoed lightly in the quiet room. Before she could sign, her phone buzzed inside her purse. Marla's eyes narrowed. Let me guess. Eleanor didn't reach for it. She simply looked at the forms, then at the glowing binders on the desk, proof of every quiet withdrawal, every assumed favor, every moment she'd chosen silence. Douglas watched her carefully. You don't have to answer that. I know, Eleanor said. But the buzzing continued, a persistent, familiar vibration that carried the entitlement she finally understood she had allowed for far too long. She lowered the pen toward the line, and as she signed her name, she knew the message waiting on that phone would collide with a version of her Samantha had never once imagined. The afternoon sunlight slanted across Douglas Trent's office as Eleanor signed the final line authorizing the account changes. Her pen left a clean, steady signature, no hesitation, no wavering strokes. Douglas lifted the page gently, checking for completion, then gave a small nod of approval. That will revoke all secondary access, he said. Once I file this, no one but you will be able to touch the savings. Eleanor breathed out slowly. It wasn't relief, exactly. It was something firmer, something earned. Good, she said softly. Douglas slid the documents into a manila folder. I'll draft the updated authorizations for you to sign before you leave. Marla, seated beside Eleanor, crossed her legs with sharp satisfaction. And then we label everything clearly, she said, tapping the tote she had brought. No more slipping things under the rug. Douglas smiled faintly. Marla mentioned you like organized records. Eleanor allowed the hint of a smile. They help me think. Then let's make sure every decision you make from here on is clearly documented, Douglas replied. When the new authorizations were printed and ready, he walked them over to Eleanor. The pages felt crisp under her fingers, each one carrying a piece of her future, her protection, her independence, her boundaries carved out after years of quiet giving. She signed every line. With each pen stroke, the faint buzzing from her phone in her purse felt further away. She didn't check it. She didn't intend to. Not until she was ready. Back at Eleanor's house later that afternoon, Marla set her tote on the dining table and pulled out a brand new binder, navy blue with a hard spine. She'd stopped by an office supply store on the way home. On the cover, a gold label read, My Decisions. Bold enough? Marla asked, raising a brow. Eleanor traced the lettering with a finger. It's perfect. Together, they spent the next hour sorting forms, creating fresh tabs, accounts, protections, estate, notes. Eleanor worked slowly but confidently, writing titles in her neat script. With every page she slid into a sleeve, something inside her settled into place. You look lighter, Marla observed. I feel clearer, Eleanor replied. They were halfway through the estate tab when the front door opened quietly. Grace stepped inside, her backpack slipping off her shoulder the moment she saw her grandmother. Grandma, Eleanor opened her arms without thinking. Grace rushed into them, hugging her with a warmth that nearly unbalanced her. Eleanor held her tight, feeling the girl's small frame tremble just a little. "You okay, sweetheart?" Eleanor asked gently. Grace nodded, but her voice stayed muffled against Eleanor's sweater. "Mom was in a bad mood this morning. She kept saying she was stressed. I didn't know what to say." Eleanor stroked her hair. "That's not your burden to carry." Grace squeezed once more before pulling back. "I just wanted to see you." That simple declaration softened every edge inside Eleanor's chest. "Sit with us," Eleanor said. "We're organizing some things." Grace set her backpack on the floor and took a seat, her eyes drifting over the neat stacks. "This looks important." "It is," Eleanor said. "Very." Grace didn't ask for details. She didn't push. She simply stayed close, her presence its own kind of support. The sun dipped lower as Eleanor finished labeling the last tab. Marla packed up her tote, glancing at the clock. "Text me if anything comes up tonight, and I mean anything." "I will," Eleanor promised. After Marla left, the house fell into the comfortable quiet that Eleanor had always loved. She placed the completed binder on the shelf beside her other records, this one heavier in meaning than all the others. Her phone buzzed again. This time, she checked it. "Michael. Mom. Samantha says the shared card isn't working. Did something happen with the account?" Eleanor read the message twice. The tone was polite, concerned, but underneath it, she heard the familiar pattern. Questions shaped around Samantha's voice, not his own. Grace sat at the kitchen island, legs dangling as she worked quietly on homework. She didn't look up. Eleanor typed her response slowly, deliberately. "I'm updating a few things." She stared at the words before pressing send. No elaboration, no apology, no explanation she wasn't ready to give. The message flew off with a soft whoosh. Seconds later, 3 dots appeared, the start of Michael composing a reply. Eleanor's breath held. The dots blinked, stopped, started again, then disappeared. She set the phone down, pulse steady. Somewhere across town, Samantha was discovering the first real boundary Eleanor had ever drawn. But Eleanor knew this was only the beginning. Because once Samantha figured out what updating a few things truly meant, she wouldn't stay silent for long. Douglas called early the next morning, his voice steady but carrying an undertone that made Eleanor pause halfway through pouring her coffee. "Mrs. Brooks," he said, "I think you should come in today. There's something I need to show you." Eleanor didn't ask what. She simply replied, "I'll be there in an hour," and hung up. Marla was already knocking on her door by the time she grabbed her purse. "You heard?" Eleanor asked. Marla shook her head. "No. I just had a feeling today wasn't going to be quiet." Douglas had the binder open on his desk before they even reached their seats. This time, he didn't bother with small talk. He turned the binder toward Eleanor, tapping a series of highlighted transactions she hadn't seen before. "These came from a secondary account attached to your savings," he said, "one we hadn't fully traced yesterday." The amounts were larger, much larger. Eleanor's breath caught as she scanned the entries. 8,000, 11,000, 5,000. Marla read aloud. "Good Lord." Douglas slid a printed document across the desk, an invoice with Samantha's signature neatly scrawled on the authorization line. Eleanor blinked, absorbing each line with slow, deliberate focus. "Kitchen renovation installment?" Douglas said quietly. "Paid for using your funds." Eleanor stared at the page. Her hands, steady all morning, finally trembled. Not violently, not fearfully, just enough to reveal the truth hitting its mark. But when she spoke, her voice held. "She used my savings," Eleanor whispered, "to update her kitchen." Douglas nodded once. "Every installment for the renovation came from your account." Marla let out a sound somewhere between a gasp and a growl. "She stole from you." She didn't just take advantage, she stole. Douglas's tone remained measured. The withdrawals were masked under general household categories, but the linked invoice removes any doubt. For a moment, Eleanor felt the room tilt, the weight of 10 years of quiet sacrifice pressing against her ribs. Not because of the money. It was never about the money. It was the knowing. It was how confidently Samantha had assumed she'd never look, never question, never challenge. Eleanor closed the binder gently. "Freeze every account she can reach," she said. Marla exhaled with relief and fierce approval. "That's the Eleanor I know." Douglas slid a stack of new forms toward her. "These will secure the remaining accounts. Once signed, Samantha will be fully restricted from every financial channel." Eleanor picked up the pen. This time, the tremor had passed. She signed each page with a calm, practiced hand, slow strokes carving a quiet boundary across legal lines. When the last page was done, Douglas exchanged it for another document. "This," he said, tapping the header, "is the beginning of a new will. You told me yesterday you wanted everything protected. If you're ready, we can remove Samantha as a beneficiary entirely." Eleanor looked at the empty beneficiary lines and felt a steady truth settle in her chest. "I'm ready," she said. Douglas began filling in the sections, his pen moving efficiently. "Once this is complete, she'll have no legal claim to your estate. Not now, and not later." Marla leaned back with a satisfied sigh. About time she learned the difference between entitlement and generosity. Eleanor didn't smile. She wasn't angry. She wasn't vindictive. She simply felt the clarity she'd carried since the dinner table. Sharper now. Undeniable. When Douglas laid the signature page before her, she didn't hesitate. She signed. One clean, decisive line. As she set the pen down, her phone buzzed inside her purse. Marla raised an eyebrow. "You going to check it?" Eleanor nodded and reached for it, not out of obligation, but readiness. It wasn't Michael. It wasn't Samantha. It was Grace. "Grandma, are you home? Mom's really upset about money today. She keeps pacing around the house and saying something's wrong. Can I come over after school?" Eleanor's heart softened at the child's steady instinct to run toward, not away. She typed a reply. "Of course, sweetheart, I'm here." She sent the message and slipped the phone back into her purse. Douglas waited a moment, then asked gently, "Are you all right?" Eleanor straightened, calm and resolute. "I'm more than all right." But behind her composure, one truth echoed clear as glass. Samantha had no idea what was coming next. And the kitchen she'd renovated with stolen money would be the first domino to fall. The following morning, the sky hung low and gray over Charlotte, the kind of weather that muted everything but thought. Eleanor pulled into Douglas Trent's office parking lot with an unusual steadiness in her chest. Yesterday's revelations still echoed, but they no longer rattled her. Marla met her at the door, already holding a travel mug of coffee. "Fuel," she said, handing it over. "Today's going to be a big one." Eleanor smiled faintly. "It already feels like it." Inside the office, Douglas had several neat stacks of documents arranged on the conference table instead of his desk. It felt deliberate. Open space, open choices. "Good morning, Mrs. Brooks," he said warmly. "We'll finalize everything today." Eleanor took a seat. The papers looked almost ceremonial. Crisp, clean lines, unblemished signatures waiting to exist. Douglas tapped the top document. "This is your updated will." He walked her through every page with patient precision, explaining each clause, each safeguard, each legal wall he'd constructed to ensure no one could manipulate her estate again, especially not Samantha. "And here," he said, sliding the final section toward her, "is the beneficiary designation." Eleanor read the name printed neatly on the line: Grace Brooks, her granddaughter, her listener, her gentlest ally. The choice felt like breathing. Marla whispered, "She deserves it more than anyone." Eleanor nodded, her voice steady. "Yes, she does." Douglas watched her closely. "Are you comfortable making Grace the primary beneficiary?" "More than comfortable," Eleanor replied. "She's the only one who's treated me with honesty." Douglas marked the page. "Then we'll sign." After the will was completed, Douglas opened a smaller folder. "One more thing to consider," he said. "Medical directives. It's smart to update everything at once so there's no confusion later." Eleanor's brows lifted. "Directives?" "Healthcare power of attorney. Living will. End-of-life preferences. They give you control. Now. So no one else makes decisions you wouldn't want." Marla muttered, "We definitely don't want Samantha deciding anything." Eleanor didn't argue. "Let's update them." Douglas reviewed her choices gently but thoroughly, what she wanted, whom she trusted, what protections mattered most. Eleanor answered every question with quiet certainty. These were decisions she'd put off for years, thinking there would always be a better time. There wasn't a better time than when clarity finally arrived. 30 minutes later, she signed the last directive with a decisive stroke. "Well," Douglas said, gathering the papers, "you now have complete control over every aspect of your estate, finances, and care. And only the people you choose will be involved." Eleanor exhaled, feeling a weight slide off her shoulders. "Thank you. Truly." "You're doing exactly what you should," Douglas replied. "This is about protecting your life, not punishing anyone." Eleanor smiled faintly. "Some people won't see it that way." As if summoned by the thought, her phone rang loudly from inside her purse, shrill, insistent, buzzing against the table with enough force to make Marla flinch. Eleanor didn't need to check the screen. "Samantha." Marla crossed her arms. "Well, here we go." Douglas looked at Eleanor gently. "You don't have to answer." But Eleanor did pick up the phone, not hurriedly, not nervously. Just with the quiet ownership she'd reclaimed in these last days. She pressed it to her ear. "Hello?" Samantha didn't waste a second. Her voice came sharp, practically cracking through the speaker. "Why can't I access the account? The card keeps getting declined. The bank says there were changes. What did you do?" Eleanor let the outburst hang in the air before she replied. "I've been updating a few things," she said, her tone calm, level. "What does that mean?" Samantha demanded. "Are you restricting the account? Is this some kind of mistake?" "No," Eleanor replied gently. "No mistake." Samantha's breath hitched audibly. "Well, I need that access. This is ridiculous. We have things to pay for. You can't just—" "I'll explain when the time is right," Eleanor said. Her voice wasn't sharp, it wasn't defensive, it was simply resolute. The same steady clarity she'd signed every document with today. Samantha sputtered, searching for words, but Eleanor ended the call with a quiet, firm press of her thumb. The room went still. Douglas exchanged a knowing glance with Marla. "That response," he said softly, was the sound of a boundary finally landing. Eleanor slipped the phone back into her purse. "She's upset," she said simply. "But she hasn't even realized the actual changes." Marla leaned forward. "What happens when she does?" Eleanor looked toward the window, where gray clouds hovered low over the city. "When she does," Eleanor said, voice calm but unyielding, "the real conversation begins." And Samantha wasn't going to like the answers waiting for her. Eleanor returned to Douglas Trent's office 2 days later, the winter sun sharp and pale above Charlotte. She felt a steadiness in her chest she hadn't expected, like she had finally stepped onto solid ground after years of soft, sinking sand. Marla insisted on driving her, claiming Eleanor needed a chauffeur for important days, but Eleanor could tell it was her friend's way of staying close. Inside the conference room, Douglas already had the will and trust documents laid out. Their arrangement felt ceremonial, almost reverent, neat stacks organized with his usual precision. "Good morning," he said with a warm nod. "Ready to finalize everything?" Eleanor answered without hesitation. "Yes." Marla sat beside her, crossing her ankles. "Let's get this wrapped and tied with a bow." Douglas walked them through a few final details before sliding the signature pages toward Eleanor. She lifted the pen, the weight of it grounding her. As she signed each document, she wasn't thinking of Samantha or Michael or even the arguments waiting down the road. She was thinking of Grace, her curiosity, her kindness, her instinct to protect her grandmother without ever being asked. When the last signature dried, Douglas handed her a small folder. "Your trust is now active, Mrs. Brooks. Grace is fully secured as the primary beneficiary." Eleanor exhaled, a breath she felt deep in her spine. "Thank you," she said. "There's one more thing," Douglas added. "You mentioned wanting to update Grace's college fund?" "Yes," Eleanor replied, opening her purse. "I've been setting money aside for her for years, quietly. I want it protected now." Douglas smiled, pleasantly surprised. "Then let's make it official." He drafted a short addendum while she waited, then showed her where to sign. Eleanor's handwriting flowed smoothly, her movements unhurried. This wasn't reaction. It was intention. That afternoon, the first ripple of her decision reached Samantha. Eleanor was placing the folder of signed documents into her new My Decisions binder when her phone buzzed on the counter. A message from Michael. Sam's card was declined again. "She says the bank system must be broken." "Are you sure everything's all right?" Eleanor read the text slowly, thoughtfully. Samantha wasn't ready to consider that the problem wasn't the bank. It was her own assumptions. Eleanor typed back, "Everything is fine. I'm all right." She didn't elaborate. She didn't soften the edge of independence she'd carved. She simply pressed send. A few minutes later, her phone buzzed again. Michael asking, "Are you sure? You've seemed busy lately." Eleanor stared at the message, feeling a flicker of sadness, not for what she was doing, but for the years she had spent cushioning consequences he should have faced sooner. She replied with a single truth, "I'm okay, Michael." And she was. Around 5 o'clock, a firm knock echoed through the house. Eleanor smiled even before she opened the door. Marla stood there holding a bakery box. "Celebratory muffins," she announced. "And don't argue, I saw the day you had." Eleanor laughed softly. "You didn't have to." "Oh, please. You signed a will, a trust, and a college fund edition. You get muffins." Inside, they sat at the kitchen island while the oven hummed warmly behind them. Marla opened the box. 6 oversized blueberry muffins, each topped with coarse sugar that glimmered under the kitchen light. Eleanor took one and broke it in half, steam curling into the air. "You're spoiling me," she said. "You've spent years spoiling undeserving people," Marla replied. "Time for a correction." Eleanor smiled, genuinely this time. The house felt different today. Not larger, not quieter, but balanced in a way she hadn't felt in years. She felt calm. Deeply, unexpectedly calm. She sipped her tea, tasting the faint citrus notes she loved. Marla chatted about a neighbor's new garden fence, but Eleanor only half listened, her mind drifting to Grace. How she'd react someday when she learned the truth behind all of today's signatures. And as if summoned by the thought, Eleanor's phone buzzed again. Marla sighed. "Let me guess. Drama?" But when Eleanor checked the screen, her pulse tightened. Samantha. Calling. Not texting. Calling. Marla's eyebrows shot up. "Well, that ought to be interesting." Eleanor stared at the glowing screen, her calm still intact, but her breath slowing as she reached for the phone. Because this time, This conversation wouldn't be about a declined card. It was going to be about everything Samantha never expected to lose. Samantha didn't bother knocking. She shoved Eleanor's front door open so hard it hit the wall, rattling a frame in the hallway. Eleanor looked up from the kitchen table where she'd been sorting her updated documents into the My Decisions binder. Marla, who had just left 15 minutes earlier, would have had a field day witnessing the entrance. Samantha's heels clicked sharply across the hardwood floor, urgent, angry, practiced. Her cheeks were flushed, her hair pulled back too tightly, her breath unsteady with indignation. "Where is it?" she demanded. Eleanor remained seated, folding a page and sliding it neatly into a sleeve. "Where is what?" "Our financial plan," Samantha snapped. "The savings, the joint account, whatever you changed. I want to see it." Eleanor didn't move. She didn't raise her voice or alter her posture. She simply continued organizing her binder with calm, deliberate motions. Samantha's frustration spiked at the lack of reaction. "Don't act like this is nothing. The bank won't tell me anything. They said I'm not authorized to speak on the account anymore." Eleanor closed the binder gently. "You're not." Samantha stared at her as if the floor had tilted. "Excuse me?" "You're not authorized," Eleanor repeated, voice quiet and even. "That's impossible," Samantha snapped. "I've had access for years." Eleanor nodded. "Exactly." For the first time, Samantha's voice faltered. She took a step closer. "What did you do? Are you trying to sabotage the family? Because that's what this feels like." Eleanor looked up at her. "I'm protecting myself." "From us?" Samantha scoffed. "From your own son?" Eleanor kept her tone soft, almost gentle. "I'm protecting myself from misuse." Samantha's jaw tightened. "Misuse? What misuse? Everything we took was for us, for the household, for needs we all had." Eleanor didn't argue the word needs. She didn't have to. The truth had lived in her highlighted binders for years. Samantha planted both hands on the edge of the table, leaning in. "You can't just shut off access like this. You can't just cut us out. Michael and I have plans, projects, bills. You know that." Eleanor looked at Samantha's hands, then lifted her eyes to meet hers. "I subsidized your life for years," Eleanor said quietly. The words hung in the room like a sudden winter draft. Samantha blinked, slowly, like she wasn't sure she'd heard correctly. "What did you just say?" Eleanor remained steady. "I subsidized your life, your renovations, your emergencies, your comforts." Samantha's face drained of color. She opened her mouth, but nothing came out. At that moment, the front door opened again, this time gently, and Michael stepped inside, looking torn between confusion and worry. "Samantha?" he called softly before noticing the tension in the room. "Mom, what's going on?" Samantha turned to him immediately. "She's restricting the account. She's freezing us out. She's trying to control everything." Michael looked at Eleanor, searching her face for explanation. "Mom, is that true?" Eleanor didn't look away. "I adjusted my accounts." "That's not what she's saying you did," Michael murmured. Eleanor folded her hands in her lap. Her voice was steady, kind, even, but unshakably firm. "I did what I needed to do." Samantha's voice rose again, cracked around the edges. "She's trying to sabotage the family, Michael. She's punishing us." Eleanor shook her head. "No, I'm protecting myself." Samantha threw her hands up. "From what?" Eleanor held her gaze, the calm finally meeting the storm head-on. "From years of being used," she said quietly. Michael flinched at the word used. Samantha spun toward him, desperate. "Don't listen to her. She doesn't understand how finances work. She's confused. She's—" "Samantha," Eleanor interrupted softly. "Show him the kitchen invoices." Samantha froze. Her breath caught sharply in her chest. Michael's eyes snapped to her. Kitchen invoices? What invoices? Samantha stood completely still, a thin tremor running through her. Eleanor spoke gently, because truth didn't need volume. The renovation was paid with my money. Michael's face drained. Sam, what is she talking about? Samantha's throat bobbed as she swallowed. It was part of our household budget. You said it was fine. You said your mom wouldn't mind. No, Eleanor said softly. He didn't. Michael looked between them, panic tightening his voice. Mom, is this true? Eleanor's eyes softened, not with pity, but with a sadness that had been waiting years to be acknowledged. Yes, she said. It's true. Samantha took a shaky step back, chest rising in uneven breaths. Michael stared at his mother, his wife. The truth hanging between them like a fracture forming in real time. But before he could speak again, Eleanor's phone vibrated loudly on the table. She glanced down at the screen. Grace, calling. And the look on Samantha's face made one thing crystal clear. The granddaughter Samantha underestimated was about to enter this battle too. Eleanor answered Grace's call with a steady voice, even though the room around her felt tight with tension. Grandma, can I come over? Grace asked, sounding breathless. Mom's been yelling, and Dad left the house saying he needed air. Can I come there? Of course, Eleanor said. I'll unlock the door. When the call ended, Samantha let out a shaky exhale, as if the room itself had turned hostile. You're turning my own daughter against me, she snapped. Eleanor said nothing. Silence, she had learned, was sometimes the clearest answer. Michael stepped away from Samantha and sank into one of the kitchen chairs. His hands covered his face for a moment before he looked up again, tired, confused, scared of what he was beginning to understand. Before anyone spoke, the front door eased open and Grace slipped inside. She froze when she saw her parents. Samantha rigid with fury, Michael pale and shaken, Eleanor quietly composed at the kitchen table. Grace walked straight to her grandmother without hesitation. Hi, sweetheart, Eleanor murmured, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. Grace sat beside her and stayed close, without needing an explanation. Samantha's nostrils flared. Grace, sit over here with us. Grace didn't move. I'm fine here. That small act, silent, decisive, hit Samantha harder than any accusation. Michael swallowed. Mom, Samantha said you're confused. That maybe this is all because your memory isn't what it used to be. The accusation didn't sting Eleanor. She had expected Samantha to reach for that excuse. It was her last line of defense. Samantha seized on it. Exactly. We've all noticed it. You mix things up. You forget details. Samantha. Michael's voice cracked, the first fracture in his loyalty. Stop. Samantha sucked in a breath but pressed on. I'm trying to help her. She's not thinking clearly. These statements, she's probably misunderstanding what half of them even mean. Eleanor opened the My Decisions binder with slow precision. Then let's not rely on my memory. She slid a single printed statement across the table, one itemized sheet, every withdrawal marked, every category that matched Samantha's self-created emergencies. The highlighter lines glowed like warnings. Michael reached for it with trembling fingers. The room went silent. He read the first page slowly, then the second, then the third. His mouth opened slightly, not in shock, but in dawning horror. 8,000, 11,000, 5,000, hundreds, dozens. Years of withdrawals Samantha swore were joint needs. Grace leaned closer to her grandmother, protective as a small guard dog. Samantha watched Michael's expression crumble. Michael, she's misunderstanding. She doesn't remember why these were needed. You know she gets confused. Eleanor didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. She reached into the binder again and placed a thick, tabbed packet on the table. Every page bore a notary stamp. Confused? Eleanor asked softly. These were verified. Michael froze. Samantha's face drained. What is that? Notarized records, Eleanor said. Prepared over the last several weeks. Cross-checked with bank reports Douglas requested directly from the credit union. Michael looked at the stamped signatures, the dates, the careful documentation. The evidence didn't just speak. It screamed. How long? He whispered. 10 years, Eleanor said. Samantha's hand flew to her mouth. Michael, don't listen. Don't you dare listen. Michael's voice rose, not loud, but firm. So you used my mother's money? For the kitchen? For trips? For all those emergencies you said we had? Samantha's eyes darted rapidly, hunted. Michael, we needed that. You said we'd pay it back. You said, no, Eleanor said quietly. He didn't. Michael pressed the heel of his hand to his forehead, his breath trembling. Oh my God. Grace slid her hand into Eleanor's, squeezing gently. Grandma, I'm here. Samantha pointed at Eleanor, desperate and trembling. You're turning them against me. This is manipulation. This is... A sharp chime cut through the chaos. Eleanor's laptop, sitting open on the counter, lit up with a new message. Douglas Trent. Subject, protections fully active. Samantha stared at the glowing notification like it was a verdict. Michael turned slowly toward Eleanor. Grace held her grandmother's hand tighter. Eleanor clicked the message. The email opened in clean, simple lines. All restrictions complete. All authorizations updated. All beneficiaries finalized. No access permitted without your consent. Douglas Eleanor closed the laptop softly. Samantha took a step back, breath ragged. You actually did this? Eleanor looked at her without anger, without spite, without fear. Yes, she said. I did. Michael's voice broke on the next word, barely above a whisper. Mom, what happens now? Before Eleanor could answer, Samantha's phone buzzed sharply in her hand. She glanced down and her face collapsed, because whatever she saw was about to shatter what little ground she was still standing on. Samantha stared at her phone as if it had betrayed her. The color drained from her face, her lips tightening until they were almost white. Whatever message she'd just seen had crushed the last of her certainty. Michael stepped toward her cautiously. Sam, what is it? She didn't answer. Instead, she turned slowly back to Eleanor, eyes blazing, hands trembling, voice sharp with disbelief and fear. You can't do this, she whispered. You can't just cut us off. You can't just decide to destroy our entire financial plan. Eleanor stood, steady and quiet. I'm not destroying anything. I'm ending my involvement. Samantha shook her head violently. No, you are destroying it. You're pulling out the foundation. We've depended on that money for years. We budgeted around it. You can't just remove yourself like you're separate from us. Eleanor inhaled slowly, grounding herself. Samantha, I am separate from you. Samantha's breath hitched. Fix the accounts. No, Eleanor said, voice like calm steel. Fix them! Samantha screamed, fist slamming onto the table hard enough to rattle the laptop. Grace flinched and instinctively moved closer to Eleanor, her shoulder pressing gently into her grandmother's side. Eleanor rested a reassuring hand on the girl's back. There is nothing to fix, Eleanor said. The sentence landed like a door clicking shut. Michael exhaled shakily, rubbing both hands through his hair. Mom, I'm so sorry, he said softly, for all of this. I didn't know the withdrawals were so much. I didn't know she... Samantha spun toward him. Don't you dare blame me. You knew we needed help. You knew your mother never said no. You said she wouldn't mind? No, Michael interrupted, voice cracking. I never said that. You told me she'd be fine with it. Samantha reeled back as though he'd slapped her. The room grew unbearably quiet. Grace reached for Eleanor's binder, closing it protectively as if shielding her grandmother's work from further attack. Eleanor's heart ached, not from regret, but from the weight of finally being seen. A firm knock sounded at the front door, cutting into the thickness of the moment. Michael wiped at his eyes. Who now? Eleanor knew before she opened the door. Marla stood on the porch, winded and looking ready for a fight. She held a fresh stack of binders in her arms. I brought the updated versions, she said briskly. Douglas sent the finalized copies earlier than expected. When she saw Samantha in the living room, red-faced, shaking, cornered, Marla's expression hardened. Oh, I see the circus started without me. Samantha glared. This is none of your business. Marla stepped inside, closing the door with deliberate calm. Sweetheart, when you storm into my friend's home, scream at her, and demand access to money that isn't yours, that absolutely makes it my business. Eleanor gently took the binders from Marla. Their weight felt reassuring, like the solid proof of choices she had finally claimed. Marla lowered her voice. You okay? Eleanor nodded. Better than I thought I'd be. Grace began sorting the new documents with her, sliding each section into place with careful hands. She didn't ask what any of it meant. She didn't need to. Her closeness spoke louder than questions. Samantha watched them, Eleanor, Grace, and Marla forming an easy, natural rhythm, while she stood off to the side, isolated by her own choices. Her anger didn't fade. It grew hollow. This isn't fair, she whispered, voice cracking. You're leaving us with nothing. Eleanor looked up from the binder, meeting Samantha's eyes with a steadiness Samantha had never expected from her. You're left with what you earned, Eleanor said. And what you earned from me has run out. Michael pressed a hand to his forehead again, shaking his head. Sam, I can't believe this. Samantha stared between the three women at the table. The grandmother she underestimated, the granddaughter who refused to abandon her, and the neighbor who'd become something like family. The room was shifting, and Samantha felt it. Her phone buzzed again. She glanced down. Her face broke. Eleanor saw it, saw the panic, the fear, the loss finally sinking in, and she understood something with crystal clarity. Samantha hadn't hit bottom yet. And whatever message she'd just read, it was only the beginning of the collapse she'd been avoiding for years. Samantha returned the next afternoon. This time, not alone. Her parents walked slightly behind her on the front porch, their postures stiff, unsure whether they were arriving for a confrontation or an intervention. Samantha stood between them, shoulders tight, jaw clenched, eyes rimmed red. She looked exhausted, but still clinging to whatever scraps of control she believed she had left. Eleanor opened the door before they knocked. Samantha's mother spoke first, her voice careful. Eleanor, we thought it might help if we all talked. Samantha stepped inside without waiting for permission, her parents trailing uncertainly. The living room felt smaller with them all in it, tension thickening the air. Eleanor stayed calm. Let's go to the dining table, she said, guiding them to the room where everything had begun. The long oak table was already set with folders. The My Decisions binder lay at the head of the table. 3 neatly stacked piles waited in front of the other chairs. Samantha froze when she saw them. What is all this? Eleanor didn't sit yet. She stood at the head of the table, steady, composed. Documentation, she said softly. Samantha's father cleared his throat. Eleanor, we came because Samantha is very upset. She says there's been a misunderstanding about finances. Samantha blinked rapidly, eyes flicking between the folders and her parents. It's not what she thinks. Mom, Dad, I didn't steal anything. Eleanor finally took her seat. She opened the first binder and turned it toward them. Bank statements, highlighted clearly, page after page. These, she said gently, are 10 years of withdrawals. Samantha's parents leaned in. Their expressions shifted slowly, from confusion to discomfort to something far heavier. Samantha's mother touched her daughter's arm. Sweetheart, these amounts. Samantha jerked away. They're out of context. Eleanor flipped the next packet. Every notarized page stamped, organized, impossible to misinterpret. These, she said, confirm the authenticity of the statements. Samantha's father frowned deeply. You told us this was about a misunderstanding, that Eleanor was confused. I didn't lie, Samantha whispered. I thought thought I wouldn't know what happened. Eleanor finished, her voice gentle rather than cruel. Samantha's throat tightened. Stop talking to me like that. Like I'm a child. Like I'm being held accountable? Eleanor asked softly. The room went completely still. Samantha's parents exchanged a quiet, stunned glance, one that suggested for the first time they were questioning the daughter they had always defended. Eleanor turned to them, not to shame their daughter, but because the truth needed witnesses. I never expected gratitude. I never asked for repayment. All I wanted was respect. Samantha's mother looked down, her lips trembling. Eleanor, we didn't know. Samantha never told us it was like this. She didn't tell Michael either, Eleanor said. Not fully. Samantha's composure cracked. I was overwhelmed, she cried, voice breaking. Everything was expensive. We were drowning. And she had money just sitting there. I thought... Her voice collapsed into a sob. I thought she wouldn't mind. Eleanor's voice softened, but it never wavered. I didn't mind helping. I minded being dismissed, mocked, taken for granted. Samantha's face crumpled in anguish. I never meant to hurt you. Eleanor folded her hands gently. Respect wasn't too much to ask. The words dropped with quiet weight. Samantha sank into a chair, covering her face. Her crying wasn't performative. It was the sound of someone finally seeing the wreckage they'd caused. Her parents stood behind her, stunned into silence. Samantha's mother placed a tentative hand on her daughter's shoulder, but her expression held disappointment, deep and unfamiliar. Then footsteps sounded in the doorway. Michael entered, shoulders slumped, eyes tired, but clearer than they'd been in years. He took in the sight of the table, the stacks of evidence, the parents, the sobbing wife. His mother sitting with a quiet dignity that shook him more than anger ever could. He walked to Eleanor, stopping beside her chair. Mom. He swallowed hard. I'm with you. Samantha looked up sharply, eyes wide with betrayal. Michael didn't waver. I didn't see it, he said, voice thick but firm. But now I do. All of it. For the first time since entering the house, Samantha seemed genuinely afraid. Her voice cracked into a whisper. Michael. Please. But Michael didn't move, and Eleanor could feel it. The balance of the room shifting, the truth finally landing, the next fracture coming. Because just as Samantha reached for her husband's arm, Eleanor's phone lit up again with Douglas's name, and the subject line read, Next Steps. The next morning arrived cold and bright, the kind of Carolina winter sunlight that made every shadow sharper. Eleanor sat at her dining table, the same table where Samantha had once rolled her eyes at her stories, now cleared except for a single manila envelope. Douglas's message from the night before had been brief. Final removal documents enclosed. Deliver when ready. There was no urgency implied, no legal drama, just quiet certainty. At 9:15 exactly, a car pulled into the driveway, then another. Eleanor didn't rise. She simply folded her hands and waited. Samantha entered first. Her steps were rigid, breaths too fast, eyes carrying an exhaustion that didn't soften her anger, only sharpened it. Behind her, her parents followed, subdued and worried. Michael trailed last, shoulders tight, jaw set with the weight of everything he'd learned. Grace sat at the table beside Eleanor, her small hand resting near her grandmother's. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Samantha stopped short when she saw the envelope. "What is that?" she demanded, voice already trembling. Eleanor tapped it gently. "The final documents." Samantha's mother looked uneasy. "Eleanor, is this really necessary?" "It is," Eleanor said. Her voice was calm, so calm it startled Samantha. Michael moved to Eleanor's side but didn't sit. He simply stood there, as if anchoring himself to the truth this time. Eleanor slid the envelope forward. Samantha didn't take it at first. Her fingers hovered, then curled back as if she were afraid to touch it. "What is this supposed to mean?" she whispered. Eleanor said nothing. Samantha finally snatched it, ripped it open, and scanned the first page. Her expression went blank. Not angry, not screaming, just hollow. "What?" Her voice cracked. "What is this saying?" Eleanor stayed steady. "It confirms the account changes and the removal of secondary access." Samantha's eyes moved frantically across the paper. "It says I'm not listed anywhere, not on the accounts, not on the trust. You took me off everything?" Eleanor nodded once. Samantha flipped to the second page, hands trembling harder. This one made her shoulders collapse forward. "The will," she whispered. I'm not included. At all." No one spoke. Samantha stared at the document like it might rearrange itself if she blinked enough times. "So I get nothing? After all the time we spent together? After everything I did for this family?" She looked up, almost dizzy. "Is this really it?" Eleanor met her eyes, direct but gentle. "Yes," she said softly. "This is my story now." Something in Samantha broke at those words, not dramatically, not loudly, just visibly, like a structure losing the last beam that held it upright. Her parents stared at her with confusion and dawning disapproval. Her father shook his head slowly. Her mother murmured, "Samantha, this is terrible." Samantha backed away from the table, breath growing shallow. No, you can't do this. You can't. We're family." Eleanor kept her voice low. "Family doesn't treat each other the way you've treated me." Samantha's face twisted with a mix of anger and pleading. "Michael, say something. Don't just stand there. Tell her this is insane." Michael swallowed hard. "Sam, I can't defend what you did." She stared at him as if he'd struck her. Then she turned her gaze to Eleanor, desperation rising like a tide. "Just give me one chance to fix this. I'll explain everything. We can undo this. We can—" "No," Eleanor said quietly. "We can't." The refusal landed like a final seal. Samantha's breathing hitched. Then, in a burst of frustrated grief, she slammed the envelope down and stormed toward the front door, her parents scrambling after her. On the porch, Samantha's mother paused, turning back with tears in her eyes. "Eleanor, we're so sorry. We didn't know." Eleanor gave a soft, sincere nod. "I know." They left with none of the pride they'd walked in with. The house fell silent. Grace leaned into Eleanor's side, wrapping both arms around her grandmother with a fierce, protective hug. Eleanor closed her eyes, letting herself feel the warmth, the steadiness of a child who had never wavered. "You okay, Grandma?" Grace whispered. Eleanor kissed the top of her head. "I am now." But as she looked at the discarded envelope on the table, its finality undeniable, she knew one truth. Samantha wasn't done fighting. And whatever came next, the hardest confrontation was still ahead. The week that followed felt strangely quiet, like a house after a storm. Branches still on the lawn, the air still unsettled, but the worst winds finally gone. Eleanor spent most mornings tidying small corners of her home, reorganizing drawers, adding new tabs to her binder. They weren't chores so much as rituals, each one reinforcing the boundaries she had set. On Thursday morning, Douglas called. "Mrs. Brooks," he said, "everything is prepared. If you're ready, we can finalize the remaining documents." Eleanor didn't hesitate. "I'm ready." The law office felt brighter than before, sunlight spilling across the conference table, dust motes drifting like flecks of quiet clarity. Douglas greeted her with the familiar calm that had become an anchor these past weeks. Marla sat beside Eleanor, already unwrapping a butterscotch from her purse. "Big day," she said matter-of-factly. Douglas opened a thin folder. "These are the final inheritance documents. Once you sign these, Grace becomes the sole heir." Eleanor ran her fingertips lightly over the pages. They felt heavier than paper, like decisions, like futures. "Grace has earned my trust," she said softly. "She's earned everything." Marla nodded. "She's the only one who showed up for you without wanting something back." Douglas pointed to the first tab. "This section covers personal assets. The next covers property. And the last—" He paused, smiling gently. "Is the new educational fund you requested." Eleanor's chest warmed. "For her first apartment," she said, "and tuition when she's ready." Douglas nodded. "Those accounts will be locked until she's 18, then transitioned entirely into her name." Eleanor signed, each stroke firm and clear. With every signature, she wasn't thinking of Samantha's disbelief, or her parents' disappointment, or even Michael's guilt. She was thinking of a 13-year-old girl who loved stories, and who had never once treated hers as boring or useless. Later that afternoon, Eleanor brewed tea when Michael arrived, standing awkwardly in the doorway like a grown man unsure whether he still had permission to enter his childhood home. "Come in, sweetheart," she said softly. He stepped inside, rubbing the back of his neck. "Mom, I've been thinking a lot." Eleanor gestured for him to sit. "I know I haven't been fully present," he said, "and I didn't protect you. I should have seen what was happening. I should have asked questions." Eleanor didn't rush to comfort him. She simply listened. Michael swallowed hard. "I've talked to a counselor. I'm going to start sessions weekly, and I want to repair things between us. If you'll let me." She reached across the table and placed her hand over his. "I'd like that." The relief in his eyes was almost boyish, a child finally stepping back toward safety. 2 days later, the storm Samantha had promised finally arrived. A letter from an attorney, her attorney, landed in Eleanor's mailbox. A formal notice attempting to contest the will. Eleanor wasn't surprised. Entitlement rarely went quietly. She took the envelope straight to Douglas's office. He scanned the paperwork with a faint, almost amused exhale. "She doesn't have a case," he said. "She'll try," Eleanor murmured. "She can try," Douglas replied, sliding the contest documents aside. "But nothing can be undone. Every clause is airtight. Every revision is notarized. Every record is time-stamped." He tapped the edge of her binder with admiration. "You built a fortress here, Mrs. Brooks." Eleanor allowed herself a small smile. "Marla would like to hear that." "And Samantha," Douglas continued, "won't get past the first review. The court will reject her filing without a hearing." Eleanor felt no joy in that, only closure. "She needs to face her own choices," she said. "And she will," Douglas replied. That evening, after the house settled into quiet again, Eleanor sat at her writing desk, the one she'd kept since her receptionist days. Its oak surface held a single sheet of stationery and a deep blue pen. Grace would be coming over tomorrow. and Eleanor wanted something waiting for her. She began to write. My dearest Grace, when the world feels loud, remember that gentleness is not weakness, it is power. And choosing kindness, even when others don't, will make you stronger than any amount of money ever could. Her handwriting flowed easily, steady, and warm. She wrote about resilience, about boundaries, about loving without losing yourself, about leaving things better than you found them, about the strength it takes to walk away, and the even greater strength it takes to stay kind while doing it. When she finished, she folded the letter carefully and slipped it into a lavender envelope. Just as she sealed it, a sharp movement outside caught her eye. Someone standing in the driveway, half shadowed by the porch light. Eleanor rose slowly, heart steady, because even without seeing the face, she knew. Samantha hadn't come to accept defeat. She'd come for something else entirely. And the final confrontation was at her doorstep. The morning after Samantha's shadow stretched across her driveway, Eleanor woke not with dread, but with a surprising, quiet clarity. The house was still. The letter for Grace rested safely in her desk drawer. Whatever confrontation waited outside her door would come in its own time, but today, Eleanor had somewhere else to be. By 10 o'clock, she was standing inside the children's corner of the community library, warm lamplight glowing across rows of picture books. The little reading rug, bright blue with alphabet letters, felt softer than she remembered. The librarian, a cheerful woman named Tess, clasped Eleanor's hands. I'm so glad you're back. The kids keep asking for your stories. Eleanor smiled. Then I'll give them a good one today. Within minutes, a small crowd gathered around her knees. Toddlers, early readers, curious faces with wide eyes. Eleanor settled into the armchair, smoothing her skirt, and opened the worn storybook she'd brought from home. Her voice carried gently through the room. Not dramatic, not loud, just warm. And the children leaned in, enthralled. The very stories Samantha had mocked as boring now held a room full of young hearts quietly captive. Eleanor felt something inside her loosen, something old, something tired. When the story ended, the children clapped, giggling as they asked questions. One little girl placed a sticker on Eleanor's wrist as a thank you. She wore it proudly the rest of the day. Grace arrived just as Eleanor stepped out of the library. She bounded down the steps, backpack bouncing, cheeks flushed from the cold. "Grandma," she called, "I brought the scrapbook." In her hands was a large lavender book, still wrapped in cellophane. "I thought we could put your stories in it," Grace said. "So we don't lose any." Eleanor touched the cover lightly, her throat warming. "I'd love that." They spent the afternoon at Eleanor's dining table, far from confrontation, far from shouting, just the peaceful scratch of scissors and the soft rustle of paper. Grace added stickers and tiny captions. Eleanor slipped in handwritten story pages, photographs from her childhood, a pressed flower from her first garden. "This one," Grace said, pointing to a photo of Eleanor at age 8, "is my favorite." "Why's that?" Eleanor asked. "Because you look brave," Grace replied. The simplicity of it made Eleanor blink back sudden emotion. Later, as the light shifted to golden evening, Marla let herself in through the back door. She held a paper bag in one arm and a thin folder in the other. "I brought pastries and updates," she announced. "In that order." Grace beamed. "Hi, Miss Marla." "Hello, sweetheart," Marla said, ruffling her hair before turning to Eleanor. "First, pastries." She placed the bag on the table. "Second, Douglas finalized the last batch of protections. Everything is sealed, double-checked, impenetrable." Eleanor exhaled softly. "Thank you." Marla lowered her voice. "And Samantha's attempt to get temporary access? Denied." Eleanor nodded, not triumphant, not vindictive, just grounded. Good, she said. She needs space to learn from this. Marla watched her for a moment. You're handling this with more grace than most people I know. Eleanor smiled at the unintended wordplay. I finally feel like myself again. Grace looked up at her grandmother, curious. Do you really? Eleanor brushed her thumb along Grace's knuckles. Yes, sweetheart. I do. When Marla left and the sun dipped low, Eleanor moved to the living room. For years, the walls had been cluttered with frames Samantha had insisted made the home look updated. Generic prints, bland decor, all purchased because they matched some trend Eleanor never cared for. Tonight, she took them down one by one. In their place, she hung photographs she loved. Her wedding day, Michael as a toddler in a cowboy hat, Grace holding a baby chick, the garden she once grew with her late husband. The room felt warmer instantly, full of memory instead of performance. Grace watched from the sofa. It looks like your house again, she said softly. Eleanor paused, looking around in the dim, honey-colored light. It does, doesn't it? She felt lighter than she had in years, as if the air itself had expanded around her. At sunset, Eleanor and Grace sat on the porch wrapped in soft blankets. Hot chocolate steamed from mugs between their hands. The sky blazed orange and lavender, the quiet kind of beauty that didn't need an audience. Grace leaned her head on Eleanor's shoulder. Grandma. Yes, sweetheart. Does everything feel okay now? Eleanor looked out at the horizon, warm breeze brushing her face, for the first time in a long, long while. Yes, she said. It finally does. But as she sipped her cocoa, a faint sound crackled from her phone inside. A notification from a number she wasn't expecting. And the peace she'd earned might be tested one last time. The faint notification tone echoed from inside the house, a small, polite sound, nothing like the chaos that had shaped the past month. Eleanor didn't move at first. She sat on the porch with Grace tucked close beside her, watching the colors of the horizon melt into soft purples. Only when the mug in her hands had cooled did she rise. Inside, her phone sat on the entry table, screen still glowing. A single message appeared. From Samantha. Eleanor took a slow breath before opening it, bracing herself for accusation, demands, another plea for reversal. Instead, she found only 12 words. I'm sorry, Eleanor, for everything. I really am. I didn't see it. The kind of apology that wasn't crafted for defense or manipulation, not polished, not strategic, just tired, honest, human. Eleanor read it once through, then again. A strange softness settled over her. Not forgiveness exactly, not reconciliation, but something gentler. A recognition, perhaps, that even the person who hurt her could stumble toward truth when the last excuse finally fell away. Grace stepped into the hallway barefoot, her blanket draped around her shoulders. Grandma, she asked quietly. Eleanor held up the phone. It's from your mother. Grace blinked, hesitating. Is she mad? No, Eleanor said. Not this time. Grace moved closer, peeking at the screen but not asking to read the words. Her small hand slipped into Eleanor's without hesitation. What are you going to do? She asked. Eleanor didn't answer right away. She simply walked to her study, Grace following silently. The room felt warm from the early evening sun filtering through the curtains. On her desk sat the lavender envelope she'd prepared for Grace, alongside the My Decisions binder that had become her quiet armor. Eleanor opened the bottom drawer, revealing a simple folder with a handwritten label. Past the edges were worn, filled with papers she no longer needed but hadn't been ready to discard. Old medical receipts, outdated bank notices, a few letters from Michael during his college years, pieces of life she had outgrown but kept as reminders. She slipped Samantha's apology inside the folder. Grace smiled faintly. You're putting it away. Yes, Eleanor said softly. Some things don't need to be carried anymore. The girl squeezed her grandmother's hand, as if sealing the decision with her own quiet approval. Outside, the sun dipped fully below the horizon. The house exhaled into its nighttime stillness, the kind of quiet that wasn't empty, but peaceful. Eleanor stepped back onto the porch, letting the warm Carolina breeze lift the edges of her hair. The trees rustled gently, their leaves glowing faintly under the porch light. The air held the scent of early winter, smoke from distant fireplaces, crispness fading into soft night air. Here, in this simple moment, she felt it. Dignity. Not the brittle kind you protect out of pride, but the deep, steady kind you reclaim after surviving someone else's assumptions. The kind that grows when you choose yourself without apology. Grace curled onto the rocking bench beside her. "Grandma, you look happy." Eleanor brushed a hand affectionately across her granddaughter's shoulder. "I feel like myself again," she murmured. Fully. Grace leaned her head against her arm. "You deserve that." They sat together in warm silence for several minutes, listening to the soft hum of cicadas and the distant bark of a neighbor's dog. The peace didn't feel fragile anymore. It felt earned, brick by brick, decision by decision. Eventually, Eleanor rose and went inside, motioning for Grace to follow. At her writing desk, she opened her journal to the last clean page. Her pen hovered for a moment, not searching for words, but choosing the right ones. She wrote slowly, deliberately. "Protect your peace." When she finished, she closed the journal with a small, contented sigh. The leather cover felt familiar beneath her palm, worn from years of thoughts tucked inside. This final line didn't feel like an ending, but a beginning. Quiet, firm, her own. Grace wandered toward the doorway, watching her. "Are you done writing?" Eleanor turned, eyes soft. "Just finished." "Can I read it someday?" Grace asked. Eleanor smiled. "Someday, yes." She rose from the desk, walked toward the porch again, and stood where the breeze caught her cardigan. She felt whole, no longer waiting for the next blow, the next demand, the next dismissal. She felt free. And for the first time since Samantha's words cut through her dining room weeks ago, Eleanor allowed herself the smallest triumphant smile. "She mocked my stories as useless," Eleanor whispered to the night, "so I let the bank statement tell one she'll never forget."